Hello, 5th through 7th grade Sunday school class. Mrs. Duncan presented me with some good questions that you guys had, and I wanted to offer you some answers. You could see I'm in my office, and you might wonder why there's a mattress behind me. We've been having people sleep over here while we host a rotating homeless shelter here at the church. So some of you know about Family Promise, but that's why. You'll probably have a question about that in the video. So I have a few questions from you, and I want to offer some answers as much as I can anyway. I'll give you some simple answers and maybe some that we find in the Bible too. So Mrs. Duncan's question list, the first one was, what do angels look like? And there's a lot of different answers that you might offer for that one. I'm going to tell you a passage from Isaiah chapter 6, when Isaiah talks about how he's called as a prophet from God. He says that he saw seraphs, which are kinds of angels, that they were flying around God's throne, and each of them had 6 wings. With 2 they covered their faces, and with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they flew. So Isaiah says that angels are creatures with 6 wings that cover faces and feet, and 2 are free for flying. In Ezekiel chapter 15 we hear about a type of angel having different faces, a face of a lion and an ox and that. The idea being that when we see angels, they're usually in a vision, and they're very hard to describe. So when we have a biblical account of an angel talking about what they look like, it's like if I asked you, if you said, I saw this like really incredible thing in my dream, and I said, well, describe me the being you saw in your dream, and you say, well, let's see, how would I describe it? A lot of the biblical attempts at describing angels are trying to describe an indescribable vision, right? So we see that in the different places in Revelation as well, the book of Revelation. In the narratives of Jesus' birth, the stories about his birth, his mom Jesus sees the angel Gabriel, so does his dad Joseph in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. And angel Gabriel is described much more as kind of like a human type looking thing. And in the Gospel of Luke, the shepherds see a heavenly chorus of angels, like an army of angels that appears to them in the field to tell them of the birth of Jesus. When we think of that, we might think of angels more as like just a source of light. So how would you describe what an angel looks like? I guess you might say that an angel could have the appearance of a few different things. And it seems that in the New Testament, especially when the angels are, their job, an angel's job, angel means messenger. So their job is to share good news with people or news of God. So especially in the New Testament, they take on the form more of a kind of a human. At the resurrection story in Easter, people are dressed in dazzling white to tell the disciples that Jesus is risen. These are messengers, they're angels. So the literal thing is that there's a lot of different definitions of creature type angels and human type angels. But if you want to look at what the word means, messenger, in that sense, an angel can look like anybody who brings us good news, and we can be angels to other people too, in a sense, right? Not a heavenly angel, but a messenger angel of God too. So I think that the qualities usually associate with angels are power and light. And also, to be an angel, they have to be a messenger. They have to be sharing some sort of good news. So that's what an angel kind of looks like in the Bible. Why are there so many battles in the Old Testament is a question. This is also a good question. I think that we have to remember when we read the Bible, it's inspired by God, but humans wrote it, right? So the Bible is a collection of humans to try and talk about how God has impacted their lives and how to follow God. And in the Old Testament in particular, we see God's people as a people who are trying to fight off invaders, trying to find their way out of slavery in Egypt to a new land. And they travel through foreign occupied areas where there's other armies that aren't really happy that they're there. And if you think about it, in our country today, maybe we don't have to worry about war invading us right now, which is a good thing. But how you might say, well, how do you see God alive in your country or in your experience? You might say, well, I see God in nature, or I see God in the way that we love one another. And, when I think about how God is active, that might be how I talk about it. But if you were in a country that was always at war and that people were always trying to fight, the way you might describe God and talk to other people about how God is powerful is about the victories that you have in war and saying our God was with us. We won this war. We won this battle. And so I think that when the people are concerned with warfare for good reason, I think that a logical way of talking about how God is present is when you win battles. And so I think that's what they recorded, because that was the story of their people, about being able to win battles and get their land, and then to be able to hold off invaders or to be conquered. So I think it's not just that God likes battles in the Old Testament. It's that the people who wrote the Bible, when they think back on all the ways they saw God active in their lives, one of the key ways is probably God was present with them in battle. Now, our experience is a little different today, and it was in the New Testament times too. So when Paul, for example, who's a disciple of Jesus, he doesn't talk about God being present in war, because he lived at a time where the Roman Empire brought peace. It wasn't always easy to stand up to the Roman Empire, but there was generally peace in Paul's time. He's not talking about war a lot. He talks about who God is in different ways. But it's because some ways he's not concerned with war, so the way he sees God show up is in a much more personal way, in a way that, we're freed from sin instead of freed from the people who are trying to do us harm. So it's not that there's a time where there's wars maybe more than other times. Maybe there's a little bit of that. But I think it's how God's people choose to try and share the message of God's faithfulness and power. And in the Old Testament, a lot of times that had to do with conquerors and battles and war. So that's why we have those stories. But they're all stories of how God shows up and how God protects God's people, if you look at it. Another question about the devil. That's a good one. That's kind of a big, broad question, right? So when people ask me about the devil, if they say, what does the devil look like? I said, there's no real description of the devil. Any description we have of the devil, quote unquote, the devil, is made up, by somebody trying to make a movie or a cartoon trying to depict this. And the devil, in a sense, is kind of a fallen angel, somebody who rebelled against God. That's in the Bible. But when we think of the devil, it's important to think of the devil in two ways. And they have to do with other names that the devil is called, right? So one of the names that the devil is called is Lucifer. And Lucifer comes from a Latin word meaning light. Or in Spanish, if you know Spanish, the word for light is luz. And you can hear how luz and Lucifer kind of go in the same way. The Latin word, same kind of thing. And when we think about that, we think about, I always talk about, when people say, what's the devil? I say, well, Lucifer, if you call Lucifer, that's not a biblical name, that's a name that's come up, but I think it's accurate in that it's a source of light that's not God. And if you've ever seen a bug zapper out on somebody's porch, I have family members that have lived on farms, they see this. The bugs fly at the zapper thinking it's the moon, thinking they're getting guided by lights, and instead they get electrocuted and die. And that sounds kind of like, whoa, that's intense. But the idea being, Lucifer is this light that's a false light. Lucifer, the devil, however you want to call it, is a false light that leads us in the wrong direction, leads us away from the real light that's God. Another title that is biblical for the devil is Satan. So in a particular passage in Matthew, there's a story about Jesus early on in his ministry where he goes into the wilderness and he confronts Satan. And Satan is defined as the tempter, somebody who tempts you, or Jesus in this case. And in this passage, Jesus fasted in the wilderness, and then he confronts temptations that these temptations ask Jesus to make himself powerful instead of being someone sent by God. The temptation is to make yourself powerful, to own it for yourself instead of always claiming to be God's servant. So, for example, in Matthew chapter 4, verse 5, the devil took him to the holy city. This is Satan previously. The devil took him to the holy city and placed him on the pinnacle of the temple, saying, "If you're the Son of God, throw yourself down. For it's written, he'll command your angels concerning you, and on their hands they'll bear you up, that you will not be dashed against a stone. But Jesus said, do not put the Lord your God to the test. It's also written that. So in other words, Satan, the devil, the tempter, was trying to say to Jesus, if you're really who you say you are, throw yourself off this building because God will protect you. And Jesus says, I don't need to do that to prove it, because it also says in the Bible, don't put God to the test for no reason. Why would I do that? Why would I put God to the test? To try and show that I'm powerful. So all to say, Satan, Lucifer, the devil, whatever you might say, I don't know that we could think about a physical look of this person or creature or thing, but rather I think just like an angel is a messenger, when we think about the devil, we think about Satan, we think about something or someone, a set of circumstances that leads us to be attracted to the wrong things, that leads us down the wrong road. That's like a light that doesn't guide us home, but takes us away from home. So if you think of God as being the source of true light, we think of the devil, Satan, Lucifer, as a source of a different kind of light that tempts us to follow it, but that it's not a real light. It's not going to lead us to a good place. What does God look like? Also a good question. Also one that there is no answer for. And in fact, in the Old Testament, Moses, who's one of God's first real messengers and first leaders in the Bible, he wants to see God. He says to God, I want to see you. This is in Exodus chapter 33. And Moses says in chapter 33, verse 18, show me your glory, I pray. In other words, he says to God, I want to see you. And God says, I'll make all my goodness pass before you and proclaim before you the name of the Lord. And I'll be gracious to whom I'm gracious and show mercy on whom I show mercy. So God's saying, you can see all the things I do. But in verse 20, God says, but you cannot see my face, for no one shall see me and live. So God is saying, you can't encounter God face to face in this life and live, because God is just too awesome to see. So later following that, God says, what I will do is I'll put you in this little cave, and I'm going to walk past you. And when I walk past you, you can see the back of my robe as I walk past, but you can't see me. Otherwise, it'll be too powerful. And when I think of that story, I think about how sometimes when we live out our lives, it's hard to tell where God is in that. But sometimes we look back and think about how maybe we felt God's presence or connection. So just like Moses only saw God after God was present, maybe I can't understand how God is dealing with a certain situation in my life. But after the situation, I start understanding a little bit more clearly. Oh, that happened, and then this happened, and that second thing was really good, so that first thing had to happen for that second thing to happen. That kind of thing. When you think about how did you meet your best friend, or how did something good happen, you think back and you think, well, I would have known that was going to be a pivotal thing in my life at that time. But looking back, I can see where God was present. And the last question that Mrs. Duncan wrote was, why was there a giant, and did God give David the power to defeat the giant? I'm assuming we're talking about David and Goliath there. So in the Old Testament, in Genesis chapter 6, they talk about this race of giants called the Nephilim, which some people say is kind of proof that aliens were among us in the Old Testament many, many years ago, centuries, millennia ago. Could very well be possible. But when we talk about Goliath, we talk about Goliath as a giant. And, back in those days, David probably would have been maybe even a shorter than usual person. Well, let's say David was 5'2", right? That might have been a regular person for his time, maybe a little short. And maybe Goliath was my size, 6'4". Well, in the history, as you retell that story over and over and over and eventually write it down, the giant just gets taller and taller in our retelling. It's like someone who caught a fish and said, yeah, I caught a fish. It was 12 inches long. But as I talk about it, it gets bigger and bigger, so that 20 years later, I caught this monster fish. So David faces off against somebody, a military hero who's way bigger than he is, and a massive person, but who might not be out of the realm of possibility. In our day and age, there's people who are 7'4" even, who play basketball, who are athletic. And if you think of that person, if you had never seen the internet or something, and you were somebody who was 5'2" or 5'4", and all of a sudden you saw someone who's 7'4", you would say they were a giant, right? You'd have nothing to compare it to. Nobody had ever told you that there are people who existed this big. And so I think that's what we're talking about when we talk about Goliath in the Bible. That Goliath is a massive person, but he's not like a superhero or some kind of crazy thing. He's just the biggest person anybody had ever seen at that point, and they wrote about it. And the question, did God give the power to David to defeat him? Yeah, probably, but if you look at the story of David and Goliath, it's really cool in that David doesn't defeat Goliath with like superpowers. He defeats him with a simple way of doing things. He takes a sling and a stone, and with a really good throw, he hits Goliath with the stone and defeats Goliath. He kills him. And it just shows you that, in the face of pressure, when David relied on God, God helped David through that situation. Now, that's a bloody situation and one of battle. Again, we hear about how David's people were under attack, and God showed up by giving them a victory. We talked about that earlier, right? But the idea, did God give David the power? Yeah, David was definitely somebody who definitely had a special relationship with God, and who God chose to be a leader among God's people. So I wonder if maybe we can all think about ourselves. I don't know that we're ever going to face down a giant in battle, but each of us is going to have certain things that we have to face in our lives, right? And I wonder if we can think of ourselves as being helped by God. Maybe God gives us strength too in the things that we do. So thanks for the great questions. Hopefully some of these answers were helpful to you. And keep them coming. If you have other questions, you can always ask. I'm always happy to answer as much as I can anyway. So take care, guys. Thanks for your questions.